Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that nice introduction, and thanks to all of you guys for having me here. So I want to begin today by saying that my presence here represents something of a paradox, insofar as I'm here to talk, at least in part, in front of a group of technologists about artificial intelligence, and even more specifically, a relatively recent approach to artificial intelligence called machine learning. But I myself am neither a mathematician nor a computer scientist. I'm not, in fact, a technologist at all. I did take one coding class in college almost 20 years ago, and the final assignment in that class was to make a virtual slot machine. I completed the assignment, and the first time that I played my own slot machine, I got 3 cherries, and the computer started to ding and flash and make noise in all the ways that I'd somehow programmed it to do. And I remember looking at it and thinking about my possible future and concluding, why don't we just stop here on a high note? I went on to be a writer, and when people ask me what kind of writer I am, I usually mumble something about how I don't have a beat, but that I tend to write very long magazine stories. This is not totally true. I do, to some extent, have a beat, but it's not very easy to describe it quickly, or it's rather delicate to do so. My beat, and I promise that I'm going somewhere with this, is that I like to write stories on subjects that I know absolutely nothing about. And the less I know at the beginning, the better. And I try not to say this out loud too often, lest it be taken as evidence of the total bankruptcy of the fake news mainstream media. Of course, I do have a huge amount of respect for my colleagues who have spent years studying one beat, but my favorite way to do a story is to begin with the knowledge of the general reader, that is the knowledge of an outsider, and do as much work as is necessary to get to the point where I can talk like an insider. I'm less interested in the having of expertise than in the development of it. So the point of this preamble, or at least one initial point, is that I'm not here today as an expert on artificial intelligence or machine learning, but I'm also not here as a complete novice to the subject who just woke up this morning and did a quick skim of the Wikipedia entry as preparation for the talk. I'm here in my capacity as a professional non-expert, or perhaps an unprofessional expert. And in this particular case, I'm here in an even slightly more abstract capacity, which is to say that I'm here as someone who fundamentally understands himself to be a humanist, but a humanist who doesn't think that we do ourselves any favors if we go about our own business in total ignorance of or outrage about what the machines are up to these days. And this talk, as I've imagined it, is pitched at humanists. And I understand that you guys are all technologists also, but to me, teachers of technology are the kinds of technologists who are most likely to be interested in the role of the human in the development of technology and the relationship between humans and machines. At the same time, though, I want to tell you guys up front that I'm not the sort of humanist who has an instinctive aversion to machines, or one that thinks that humans are really special just because we happen to be humans. I think we can all agree that humans are capable of terrible things, and I suspect that many of us over the past year would, despite our reservations about the relentless march of automation, have been infinitely happier under the rule of some benign robot overlords. I mention this now right up front because there's a tendency among humanists when faced with the infinite-seeming proliferation of technology and computation to defend our species with recourse to a list of the things that machines are not. The idea is to line up the machines on one side and the humans on the other and identify which are the things that the machines are good at and which are the things that are somehow inviolably ours. These divisions of labor tend to get very sentimental, very sappy, and very ahistorical very quickly. Machines are cold and amoral, whereas humans are always warm and never perform a single action without subjecting it to the rigorous standards of the categorical imperative. Machines have no sense of beauty, whereas humans wake up before dawn every morning just to behold the simple majesty of a sunrise. I could go on. The problem with lists like these is not just that humans very often don't live up to our own best ideals. It's that we're basically giving away the entire game right up front. We're sitting at the negotiation table with the machines and those who build them and saying, okay, so we're going to give you guys all of the areas of human activity, or activity in general, in which we care about things like usefulness or precision or efficiency, and we're going to keep on our side everything that relates to beauty and warmth and joy. But this reduces the whole of human enterprise to the cosmetic. On this vision, the future is run by a central server that decides where our homes and offices should be located and the best way to get between them, and our only input is the color of the autonomous car that the robots send to pick us up in the morning. And maybe, if we're lucky, the music that the autonomous car is playing. We don't want to make the case that the future of humanity is that the machines will do all the work and we will serve them as their interior designers. Obviously, I'm being a little bit extreme here, but I do think that this is one reflex that humanists have when they take up conversations about artificial intelligence in the future, and I think it's not in our best interest to trade the ambition to be useful in the hope that we can protect our roles as color or fabric consultants. I want to try here to talk a little bit about how we might compete on the level of usefulness, which seems to me the very crux of the issue for educators, especially educators who are also technologists. So I want to close this little introduction with a kind of meta story, a story about the artificial intelligence story that brought me here to you guys. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I haven't even told you about the story itself yet. But just about a year ago, I published an extremely long article in the New York Times Magazine about the state of AI, which meant a history of the very idea of this thing called machine learning, and a description of where it came from and how it works and where it might be going. This was a story that was fundamentally about the idea that a computer could be taught the way that a toddler is taught. So in some ways, it was about the shrinking gap between the abilities of machines and the abilities of humans. So this story comes out, and a few days later, I get an email from someone who runs one of the biggest hedge funds on Wall Street. And he's asking me if I'll come into his office to meet with him to talk about a project. Now, everybody knows that Wall Street is one of the places where quantitative technologies like machine learning have really taken off over the past decade or so and changed the way that these guys invest. It's no longer an industry driven by human analysts so much as it is an industry built on the quantitative insights you can derive from the algorithmic processing of unimaginably massive data sets. When this hedge fund guy had asked me to come in to meet with him, I assumed that he wanted some additional trading edge, that he wanted me to hook him up with somebody at Google or at Stanford, or that he wanted to glean some unpublished bit of insight about the very next steps in machine learning. But what he actually wanted was the opposite. He told me that he'd read my magazine story and that he wanted to offer me a job as precisely the kind of human qualitative analyst that the industry had been laying off for years. I didn't take that job, and if I had, I'd probably be at a party in Davos right now. But I want to frame the rest of this today as a discussion of why exactly he might have offered me a job in the first place. The phrase artificial intelligence, as many of you I'm sure know, first appeared in the proposal for a seminal summer conference at Dartmouth in the mid-1950s. The conference organizers wrote, quote, "We propose that a 2-month, 10-man study of artificial intelligence be carried out during the summer of 1956 at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. The study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. An attempt will be made to find how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans, and improve themselves. We think that a significant advance can be made in one or more of these problems if a carefully selected group of scientists work on it together for a summer." Close quote. Spoiler alert, 10 people working together over 2 months did not, in fact, solve the problem of artificial intelligence. But the reason I read you that mission statement is because it sets out the way that many people thought about artificial intelligence for a long time. That all you had to do was describe the steps in a human task with such precision that a computer could simulate that task. For the rest of the 20th century, almost everybody working on problems in artificial intelligence, and for the moment at least we can bracket what exactly a problem in artificial intelligence was and is, proceeded with this definition in mind. And collectively this became known as the symbolic approach to AI, because it involved the manipulation of logical symbols. The example I used in my article was of a computer that was programmed to identify a cat. Imagine the various steps one might set out to explain as precisely as possible the set of rules for how one might identify a cat. So first, does it have 4 legs and fur? Does it have whiskers? Does it have pointy ears? Does it make a meowing sound? And ideally, once you've broken down the nature of catness into all of these simple constituent parts, the computer can go down a checklist of if-then statements, and at the end, the computer can say that either yes, this thing in the picture is a cat, or no, it's a vacuum cleaner or a coat rack or some other non-cat object. Now, if you think about it for a minute, you could probably imagine the ramifications of this approach. It works really well for some things and much less well for others. Like in the example of the cat identifier. The minute that you show the computer a hairless cat, say, or a cat with folded ears, the whole thing can break down. And it's what artificial intelligence researchers call brittle, which is to say that it works for a relatively narrow band of cats, but certainly not for every cat example you could come up with. On the other hand, however, for some things it works really, really well, like chess, for example. Chess is a game with very explicit rules, so it's fairly easy to teach a computer how to play. And sure enough, by the early 1960s, there were computers that were pretty good at chess. There's a natural tendency in all fields to use your successes to define the parameters of future investigation. So at a certain point, the computer scientists who are working on the development of AI looked at their track record and they said, okay, it seems like we do pretty well with problems like chess and much less well with problems like how to successfully identify a cat. So what we're going to do is we're going to define intelligence that we're trying to simulate as the ability to play chess well. That is, they defined intelligence for their purposes with what we consider to be the higher cognitive processes rather than the lower ones. And when they worked on future problems, they trained computers to do increasingly complex things and didn't worry that these sophisticated computers still couldn't do fairly simple things. Because as they thought of it, those simple things somehow weren't important parts of what intelligence even was. By the 1980s, after a few decades of this approach, a roboticist at Carnegie Mellon gave this whole phenomenon a name, Moravec's paradox. And this was the paradox that by then it was fairly easy to get a computer to do things that an adult could do, not just chess, but calculus, for example, and still very, very hard to get a computer to do things that even a very small child could do, like pick up a green ball or identify a cat. He thought that it was possible that artificial intelligence had trapped itself by working within such a narrow definition of intelligence, and that it had perhaps come to a sort of dead end, and that maybe they'd be better off starting over with a slightly different idea of what intelligence even was. They didn't actually have to look very far. For decades, even though the dominant idea in computer science research was that all you had to do was spell out the rules explicitly enough and you could get a computer to do anything a human could do, there was always a dissenting opinion. There was, in fact, a whole family of dissenting opinions, from philosophers, from psychologists, and from other computer scientists. These opinions might have differed a little bit in the details, but overall, they had a common argument. They thought that it was silly and inaccurate to describe intelligence as the application of cognitive rules. A child doesn't, after all, learn to identify a cat because he or she has been taught an exhaustive list of cat criteria and taken through a set of if-then statements. A child learns to recognize a cat because he or she has seen a lot of examples of things that adults call cats. There is, they thought, a ton of stuff you have to learn about the world before you can even begin to break tasks down into a set of explicit steps or rules. And in fact, one prominent philosopher at Berkeley said that artificial intelligence, at least this symbolic version, would be totally impossible because it would only work if you could teach a computer every single detail about the world. There were attempts within computer science beginning in the 1940s and continuing through the mid-1960s to build a version of artificial intelligence that approached the entire concept of intelligence differently. The proponents of this version thought, if a child doesn't learn to recognize a cat based on an explicit set of rules, why should a computer? They wanted to build computational models that they thought would work the way the brain works, and they called them neural networks. I'm not going to get into the details of these here today. If you are curious, you can read the article where I try to spell this out in layperson language that's fairly technical. But the general idea was that instead of teaching a computer criteria or rules, you just showed the computer a lot of examples of a cat on the hunch that it would come to learn by example, the way that a toddler learns. It's important to note, even if we're not going to go into the technical details right now of how the whole thing works, that the argument is not just over a computational strategy. It's over a totally different way of understanding what consciousness is and what the mind does. These dissenters believe that our mind did not work on the basis of logical operations, but on the basis of pattern matching. So even if I'm going to stay away from the technical details here, I do want to spend a minute getting into the intellectual history of this argument. Basically, over the course of the 1950s, computer scientists were trying both things. Most of them were trying to use rules and criteria and logic to build computers that could play chess or eventually launch a space shuttle. But some of them were still trying the alternate way, working on these neural networks that learn things like how to identify a cat by trial and error. One main person working on the second path was called Frank Rosenblatt, and he wasn't actually even a computer scientist. He was a psychologist who taught at Cornell, and in the late 1950s he got funding from a research division of the Navy to work on a primitive neural network that he called the Perceptron. He thought that within a few years, as a New York Times story put it at the time, it would be able to, quote, walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. Suffice it to say that it did not do any of those things, or we all would have heard about it a long time ago. The reason that almost nobody now has heard of it is because it was basically strangled in its crib. The murderer was a brilliant MIT scientist named Marvin Minsky, who later became known as the father of AI research. Now, Minsky himself had actually worked on neural networks for his thesis at Princeton, and in theory, he was sympathetic to the ideas behind them. But in the late 1960s, he published a devastating attack on the perceptron, claiming that while it might be a good idea in theory, it would never work in practice. He even provided a rigorous mathematical proof that there were some problems that a perceptron could never solve. The whole field of computer science read his book and concluded that neural networks were a dead end, and that from that point on, if you wanted to pursue them seriously, you were basically laughed out of the academy. From the standpoint of mathematicians and computer scientists, this was just the rational progression of science. Frank Rosenblatt took an idea, he tried to build something out of it, and he failed. Marvin Minsky came along and proved to everybody beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a stupid, unworkable idea, and the field abandoned it. But there are circumstances that suggest that this story was a little more complicated. First of all, Rosenblatt and Minsky had gone to high school together at Bronx Science, and they had a long-standing rivalry. Second of all, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a lot of money floating around, especially from the government, to be used for AI research. But by the end of the 1960s, that had really changed. AI hadn't made a lot of progress, and politicians believed that for us to be successful in the Cold War, we had to make sure that the Defense Department's research spending was concentrated on projects that might have an immediate impact on national defense. All of a sudden, that Defense Department money was not as easy to come by, so there was a lot more competition for it. Minsky and Rosenblatt were competing for the same resources, so Minsky had a strong incentive to show that the other team's ideas were totally wrong-headed and shouldn't get any future funding, so that there would be more money to go around for projects like his. And Minsky won. This was in part because of his reputation within the field, and in part because soon after Minsky's book was published, Frank Rosenblatt tragically died in a boating accident, which means he wasn't around for very long to try to defend his ideas. So by the late 1960s, if you wanted to work on neural networks, that is, if you believed that human cognition was less about logic than it was about pattern matching, and if you wanted to build computers that operated according to these principles, you were out of luck. And if you decided to go ahead and work on it anyway, for a very long time, this meant rapid career suicide. But it only really meant career suicide if you were a computer scientist, because the ideas themselves did not go away. They just moved departments. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the concepts behind neural networks were still taken seriously by philosophers of mind and cognitive psychologists, even if they had different names for what they studied. These people called their ideas connectionism or parallel distributed processing. If you were a computer scientist and you wanted to try to pursue these ideas, not that there were too many of these, you had to cross the quad to work with the people in the humanities and social sciences who still believed that this was the right way to understand how consciousness and the brain worked. There were really only a handful of computer scientists who kept working on neural networks throughout these dark ages, and almost all of them were in Canada, where it was still possible to get pure research funding, even if it didn't seem like it was likely to have immediate military applications. These guys believed that Rosenblatt's perceptron was a good start. They believed that Minsky was right about some things and wrong about others. Basically, without getting into the details, that a very simple neural network like the perceptron would never really do anything too interesting, but that a bigger, more complicated version of the same idea might in fact work. The problem was that they themselves could never really get these more complicated neural networks to work either. There was a reason for this. They believed that computers were just not big or powerful enough yet, but that once computer hardware had gotten a lot better and faster, they would be proven right once and for all. Their colleagues in computer science continued to laugh at them as a set of mystics and weirdos, which was sort of a reasonable response to what they saw as a lame excuse for the other team's failures. If we just have a bigger one, it'll work, they said. Sure it will, the mainstream computer scientists said. And then starting in the mid-1990s, and continuing through the first decade of this century, the small handful of people who were still toiling away on these ideas in the dark had their first real successes. They managed to show that it would work for handwriting identification, for example. And by the late 1990s, these ideas had their first industrial applications at banks, which used them to automate the process of reading checks. With these successes, more and more younger people started to work on neural networks, but they still remained a fringe part of the discipline. But then finally, in 2011, a few computer scientists at Google decided that maybe it was time to try to make these ideas work for real, and that they were going to take the risk of throwing some money at these fringe researchers. And in basically 2 years, they turned the entire discipline of artificial intelligence on its head. The word neural networks had been stigmatized for so long that they called what they did machine learning. But the ideas were the same, and all of a sudden they worked amazingly well for things like speech and image recognition, much, much better than any of the old traditional approaches had ever worked. The success was astounding enough that soon Facebook and Amazon and all of the other big companies followed suit, to the point that some academic researchers were offered starting salaries in the 7 figures to leave academia and work in Silicon Valley. There were a lot of people who started to think that these techniques were going to revolutionize everything from public transport to farming. I'm not joking about the latter. The John Deere company has put huge amounts of money into the development of autonomous tractors driven by machine learning. If you ask a computer scientist at Google or Facebook today how all of this happened, they will either take the rise of machine learning totally for granted, If they are a 22-year-old just out of Stanford or MIT, it's the only technology they've ever known. Or if they're a little older, they'll say, yeah, I guess these ideas had been around for a while, but everybody knew that the hardware just hadn't caught up yet. But these notions are, as I think I've shown, totally wrong. The real history here is that these ideas were killed off as a part of a human argument over personal differences and funding sources, in addition to issues with computer hardware. And that a tiny group of fringe weirdo computer scientists, supported mostly by the Canadian government, along with stodgy philosophers of mind and cognitive psychologists, had never really given up on these ideas and had faith in them even at the cost of their own careers and reputations. So, why am I telling you all of this? What is the moral of this story? And why is this important for technology educators? Well, I think there are a lot of morals to this story. Some of them can be drawn from the history of ideas I just went through, and others can be drawn from the rise of the technology itself. These two things are, I think, related, but I'm going to treat them separately for the moment. So first, I think that the moral to the story of the last 5 or 6 decades of neural networks and machine learning have to do with the value that we place on such humanistic disciplines as history and philosophy, and on social sciences like sociology and psychology. It seems to me that it's a real shame that if you go and ask some 22-year-old computer scientist about the rise of machine learning, you'll probably get a shrug. Most technologists care much more about the future than they do about the past, because their naive assumption is that science always marches forward, and that the only thing to be found in the past is a record of experiments that did not pan out. History, to many of them, is just a graveyard for bad ideas. Why does it matter where all this stuff came from, they're likely to ask, if it works? Ideally, mathematics exists outside of the realm of space and time, so if the math works now, it just meant that people in the past were doing it wrong. To them, the past is just full of people who were bad at math. But that is a terrible and a terribly inaccurate idea to think about history. You could choose almost any technology as an example, but the story of the rise of machine learning works as an ideal case study. That history is not just about how people in the past were unfortunately not as good at math as people in the present. It's a story about how a set of interesting ideas were subject to the forces of individuals and their individual personalities and powers. Individuals like Frank Rosenblatt and Marvin Minsky, and the Google executives who decided to take a risk on an old, unproven technology. And even more importantly, the forces of big, powerful institutions like our Defense Department, the Canadian government, universities like Carnegie Mellon, and large companies in Silicon Valley. Scientists distrust the use of historical counterfactuals because they are uncontrolled experiments. That is, you can imagine how things might have been different if only one or two things had changed, but you have no way of knowing if everything else would have stayed the same. But it seems to me that there are a lot of important lessons here in the posing of historical technological counterfactuals. What might have happened if the government in Washington hadn't passed an amendment that said the Defense Department funding had to go to projects with immediate military applications? What might have happened if the Canadian government hadn't stepped in to take up the slack? What might have happened if Frank Rosenblatt hadn't died in that boating accident, or if various philosophy departments had been shut down because there wasn't enough academic funding to keep such an arcane discipline going? Obviously, when you start to ask these questions, you're departing from the rigorous study of history and stepping into the realm of science fiction. But these days, it's hard not to see a lot of science fiction writers, and not just famous mainstream ones like Isaac Asimov or Ray Bradbury, but paranoid weirdos like Philip K. Dick, as the greatest and most imaginative and most prescient prophets of the contemporary technological moment. So what then does this mean practically? It seems like every day we read something about the future of automation. That self-driving trucks will put millions of long-haul truck drivers out of work in the next 10 years, or that AI-driven medical diagnosis will mean the end of human radiologists. All of these warnings are true, and it's important to heed them. But when you ask people in Silicon Valley what we should do to prepare young people for that world of total automation around the corner, we tend to get one response. And that response is, teach more coding. The idea is that if young people are going to be able to compete in tomorrow's economy, they need to become technologists themselves. Nobody will have to drive the trucks, but lots of people will have to write the software that make the trucks drive themselves. Now, this is definitely not a stupid response, and I do think that everyone should have an opportunity to study coding, at least to become literate enough to read it. But at the same time, it is a response that makes me skeptical. First of all, it's definitely aligned with the economic interests of these big companies themselves. Right now, there's ruthless competition for qualified engineers in Silicon Valley, and the more that young people study coding, the lower their ultimate labor costs are going to be. And second, if you believe all of the hype about automation, you also have to believe that one of the things that will be automated is the work of human coders, especially when the whole idea behind machine learning is that you just build a machine brain and let it figure everything else out on its own. For people, especially educators, who identify as humanities people or social scientists, the immediate defensive response is, as I suggested at the beginning, to say that it's important to study the humanities or the social sciences because that's the only way that humans will learn about things like ethics and beauty. But again, the problem with this is that humans don't actually have a great track record with ethics, and beauty is so easily deprioritized as mere cosmetics as the paint job on the self-driving truck. One of the reasons that I told this long story about the history of the ideas behind machine learning is that it makes a case for the humanities and the social sciences on practical, instrumental grounds, that it doesn't cede all of the important stuff to the engineers and the mathematicians. The history of machine learning makes a very clear and undeniable case for why it might be important not only for budding philosophers or historians to study programming, but for budding programmers to study philosophy and history. Because, again, to posit a counterfactual, who knows? Maybe if more engineers in the 1970s and 80s had been studying philosophers of mind like Gilbert Ryle or Daniel Dennett, or the work of cognitive psychologists, they wouldn't have wasted so much time on AI projects that were almost certainly never going to work or have severe limitations. But the case I want to make today for humanistic study isn't only based on this particular story about how a promising technology was abandoned and then almost accidentally rediscovered. It's based on what those technologies actually do. Machine learning, as I said, is based on the notion that for a large swath of human activities, you can't just give a computer a list of explicit instructions and expect it to fare very well. You have to give it millions and billions of examples of spoken language in the example of voice recognition, or labeled images in the case of image recognition, and it will begin to spot patterns. Those patterns might not be exactly the same patterns that humans can pick up. For example, in the Google image recognition technology, they found internally that the computer had kind of invented a category of like part furniture, part animal, like ottomans with legs and stuff. But it doesn't really matter what those patterns are, because the patterns work well enough that a computer can pick out a cat that's half buried in snow, or a cat peeking out from underneath a couch, or a cat with no fur or folded ears. The patterns that they are picking out are based on statistical analysis. After being exposed to billions of pictures labeled cat, they can identify a new picture of a cat with great probabilistic certainty. They haven't learned some platonic essence of catness. They have just learned a set of statistical likelihoods based on previous experience. In fact, what they do isn't really identification in the way that we're used to thinking about it. It's something much closer to prediction, in the way that we can predict future weather based on past weather. They can predict future instances of cat based on all their past instances of cat exposure. There are two big problems with this. The first is that it all depends on the data that is shown in the first place. And if you have bad data, you're going to have bad or harmful predictions. Data sets can encode a lot of awful human attitudes about gender, for example, or about race. The machines might be doing the learning, but there remains a strong human element in the initial categorization of the inputs. If your data set had a picture of a man and a woman in suits that someone had labeled woman with her boss, that relationship would be encoded into all future pattern recognition. Labeled data is thus fallible in the way that all past human labelers are fallible. If a machine was asked to identify creditworthy candidates for loans, it might use data like felony convictions. But if felony convictions were unfair in the first place, if they were based, say, on discriminatory drug laws, then the loan recommendations would also be discriminatory. There are tons of examples of this. And if you want to read a very good book about it, I suggest you look up Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, which maybe you guys have seen before. The second big problem with this is probably more salient for us today, because it's not like you guys are going to teach classes in rigorous data labeling. The second big problem is that because machine learning is a statistical method for prediction, it only works when the future is a lot like the past. If the future is going to be different, if history's arc is bending, the machines won't be very helpful, or they're going to do great damage. Look, for example, at all of the polling that was done in the run-up to the 2016 election. The pollsters were wrong not because they were stupid, but because the 2016 election was very different for all sorts of reasons than all presidential elections before it, and the inferences that they made about voter behavior just no longer applied. Some of you guys might remember, though, that there actually was one major poll that was right about the election, the one conducted by the LA Times and the University of Southern California. The man that designed that poll was not a professional political scientist or activist. His background was in how people make decisions about their personal finances. And he didn't ask people like normal polls did if they were going to vote for Trump or Clinton or a third-party candidate. He asked people to rate their likelihood of voting for one candidate and of voting at all on a scale from 1 to 100 to be able to capture general shifts in mood. He also weighted his poll responses differently because over time he developed a hunch that the election was going to come down to turnout among white voters who hadn't showed up at the polls in 2012. Where other pollsters just imagined that turnout across demographic groups was going to be more or less consistent with how it had been in the past, he had the insight that this election might see a big shift in voter behavior. Lots of journalists and academics who were on the ground during the election, at Trump rallies and in places like Appalachia, came to the same conclusions based on their observations and interviews, but still we all tend to trust hard numbers over anecdotal conclusions. His hard numbers were the only ones that were more or less correct, and in the end they supported those anecdotal conclusions. But of course, there's no special foolproof way to learn how to predict when the future is going to be different from the past, and how exactly it will be different. If there was, all of us would be making a killing in the stock market. But the basic assumption among engineers and mathematicians and computer scientists and pollsters and other quantitative folks is that the future is going to look more or less like everything that's already happened. They believe that the future might, the basic assumptions in the humanities and social scientists, however, tend to be a little different. They believe that the future might look like the past, but that it's worth looking into and thinking about all of the ways that it might not. For some people, this means reading a lot about exactly how we got here in the light of big historical discontinuities. In politics, this might mean the French or Russian revolutions. In science, it might mean Copernicus's insight that the Earth revolves around the sun, or Darwin's idea that we are descended from apes. In art, it could be Duchamp's ready-mades or Picasso's Cubist portraits. For other people, this might mean reading a lot of novels, because the work of the novelistic imagination is in part the ability to recognize the role of chance and contingency in human affairs. Either way, this is a sphere in which the humanities and the social sciences, with their emphasis on the qualitative, are poised to make important contributions that are likely to escape the notice of the technologists who are building our automated future based on quantitative analysis as we speak. Which brings me back around to that job offer I'd mentioned. That hedge fund manager had become very successful for a decade, making investments based on the recommendations of complex algorithms produced by the finest mathematical minds. But he thought that it was time for a change. By now, every hedge fund is full of mathematicians and computer scientists, and he figured that they no longer gave him a distinct competitive edge. He thought the near future was going to be very unpredictable, and he wanted researchers who might bring a different set of tools to his financial practices. I told him I liked my job and I wasn't interested in a change. But it said a lot about humans, I thought, that he even would have thought to ask. Thank you guys very much.